I've spoken of 1,000 points of light, of all the community organizations that are spread like stars throughout the nation doing good. We will work hand in hand, encouraging, sometimes leading, sometimes being led, rewarding. We will work on this in the White House, in the cabinet agencies. I will go to the people and the programs that are the brighter points of light, and I'll ask every member of my government to become involved. The old ideas are new again because they're not old. They are timeless. Duty, sacrifice, commitment, and a patriotism that finds its expression in taking part and pitching in.
Hello, I am George H.W. Bush. I was the 41st President of the United States of America, as well as, at different points, a member of the House of Representatives, an ambassador to the UN, and the director of the CIA. What you just heard was part of my 1989 inaugural address, where I talk about my views for the country. However, today I'm not here to look at what I did during my presidency, but rather what I did beforehand, in the 1980s, when I was the Vice President for Ronald Reagan's administration. Before I talk about what I was doing during the 80s, I'd like to touch a bit on my background. I was born on June 12, 1924 in Milton, Massachusetts, to Prescott and Dorothy Bush. We were fairly well off. We weren't too much affected by the Depression, and I was able to attend good schools. However, right after graduating, I enlisted in the Navy as World War II broke out. I did a fair bit in my time there, but after the war ended, I was relieved from duty. I had met my wife Barbara beforehand and was able to marry her afterwards. We had 6 kids, including some you may know, such as George W. Bush and Jeb Bush. After the war, I still managed to further my education by attending Yale University. Following this, I started my political career in the early 60s. Pretty soon I became a fairly well-liked candidate, and in 1966 I won a seat in the House. I then became an advisor to Nixon, who made me ambassador to the UN, and then was brought in by President Ford in 1976 to be director of the CIA. This brings us up to 1980, during the election where I ran in the preliminaries against Ronald Reagan. In the preliminaries of the 1980 election, it was fairly close for a bit, but Reagan ended up winning major victories over me and I dropped out. Despite that, he made me his vice presidential candidate, and of course ended up winning the election overall. Now, during the first while I spent as vice president, my priority was just following what Reagan did. I didn't want there to appear to be any rifts within the White House, or appear like our leadership was divided and weak. However, when Reagan's assassination attempt occurred, I had to step up a bit. I still tried to make sure people didn't think I was trying to wrest power from him, but I took on responsibilities like presiding over cabinet meetings and meeting with both domestic congressional officials and foreign leaders. After his recovery, Reagan assigned me to chair 2 special task forces. One was on deregulation, as in making so the government has less and less to do with the economy and lessening the amount of social programs and things like that, and the other being drug smuggling. In other words, the war on drugs. These were the 2 notorious aspects of Reagan's campaign that I was most involved in. Something else I did as Reagan's vice president was tour Western Europe in order to get NATO allies to agree to allow the US to implement new types of nuclear-capable missiles. After Reagan's re-election in the second term now, there were negotiations held with Mikhail Gorbachev in an effort to foster more cooperation between the US and USSR. Though I did not participate in these negotiations directly, I made sure to leave an impression with Gorbachev while I was there that if I was the successor to Reagan, I would attempt to continue to foster peace between our two nations. Perhaps my lowest point in my career as Vice President to Reagan was with the Iran-Iraq war controversy, where it was found that our administration was selling weapons to Contra rebels in order to fight off the leftist Nicaraguan government. Now, I had nothing to do with this, and I was out of the loop, as I had said back then. However, many still accuse me of being aware of the situation. Something I was more directly involved in with the Iran-Iraq war conflict was a case where one of our naval vessels accidentally shot down a civilian Iran Air flight. Now, I defended the crew of this vessel before the United Nations because I believe that what they did made sense and was necessary for wartime. They had no way of knowing it was a civilian craft, and in all likelihood, in that situation, they would have every reason to believe it was a military craft, and they may have been in danger. So, the action they took was appropriate, and I said as such before the United Nations. Now, that about catches us up to the end of the 1980s, besides the last couple years. In the 1988 presidential election, I ran and I managed to win. After my inauguration in 1989, I held the Malta Summit with Mr. Gorbachev in December in order to further foster peace between our countries after the communist governments of Eastern Europe all collapsed in that same year. In these talks, we were very successful, and we even allowed a reunified Germany to join NATO with Gorbachev's approval. And that was what my career was like during the 1980s. Now, of course, a lot of important things happened afterwards, as most of my presidency took place after the 80s were over. Even though many criticize my handling of domestic economic affairs during my presidency, many also praise my handling of foreign affairs. I oversaw the invasion of Panama in order to remove its tyrannical leader, and I organized Western nations in order to take a stand against Iran in order to leave Kuwait when they invaded. My career in the 1980s, as well as immediately afterwards as president, had their ups and downs. Many people took issue with domestic affairs, and there were some controversies, but we also had major successes, especially in foreign affairs. Despite this mixed bag, when I look at my life and my career during the 80s specifically, I see that despite the controversies and whatever else, it was still in a good enough place where I was able to be elected president at the end of the decade. So, though it was certainly not all perfect, if I had to say, I would say that my life during the 80s was perhaps not totally, but at least decently radical. Thank you.